In the case of any crime, evidence is crucial. Whether it be physical or cyber, we have to have evidence, and that leads to solving the crime. Of course, we can't trust the evidence if it was planted. Sentinel Labs, who provided a lot of the context for this video, have released a report on an advanced persistent threat that has planted evidence onto computers and other electronic devices of government dissenters for around the past decade. They've named this APT, Modified Elephant. That's a lot to unpack, so let's get into it. Hi everyone, my name is Seth with Seth on Security, where we talk about cybersecurity topics and the ethical implications that they may have on our lives. If you like the content of the channel, please like, consider subscribing, and let's talk about Modified Elephant and planting evidence. So first we got to talk about who is Modified Elephant and why did they come into light. Modified Elephant is the name of an advanced persistent threat that was given by Sentinel Laboratories. Sentinel Laboratories released this report after an investigation into Modified Elephant. The group is responsible for targeted attacks on human rights activists, human rights defenders, academics, and lawyers across India with the objective of planting incriminating digital evidence. The objective of Modified Elephant is long-term surveillance that at times concludes with the delivery of, quote, evidence, files that incriminate the target in specific crimes. These occur prior to conveniently coordinated arrests. Activists, human rights defenders, journalists, academics, and law professionals in India are the most highly targeted. This case really came into light with a few targets that included individuals from the Bhima Corrigan case. So you may not be familiar with this case, so let me give you some background. The Bhima Corrigan case occurred after the celebrations that bear the same name on January 1st, 2018. It's an annual celebration of the battle that took place there. The event led to protests and violence that resulted in at least one death. In the following months, Maharashtra police linked the cause of the violence to the banned Naxalite Maoist Communist Party of India, who were accused of inciting the riots. Now, a few months later, April 17th, 2018, police conducted raids and arrested a number of individuals on terrorism-related charges. The arresting agencies identified incriminating files on the computer systems of defendants, including plans for an alleged assassination attempt against Prime Minister Modi. Now, here's where it gets interesting. It turns out that compromise of defendant systems led to the planting of files that were later used as evidence of terrorism and justification for the defendant's imprisonment. The intrusions in question were not isolated incidents. So, what evidence was planted in this case? There were more than a dozen activists that were targeted in the investigation. An attacker, we're attributing to Modified Elephant, used malware to infiltrate a laptop that belonged to one of the activists, named Rona Wilson, before his arrest, and deposited at least 10 incriminating letters on the computer. Jaya Roy, who is a spokeswoman for the National Investigation Agency in India, the anti-terrorism authority overseeing the cases against them, said that the forensic analysis of Wilson's laptop conducted by law enforcement did not show any malware on the device. She added that there was, quote, substantial documentary and oral evidence, end quote, against the individuals charged in the case. So it sounds like they don't think there was any compromise of the computers and the evidence was already there. It's important to note here that these activists are outspoken opponents of Modi's government, and they've all denied the charges which accuse them of working with a banned Maoist militant group to wage an insurgency against the Indian state. That's the terrorism charge. That's pretty huge, as this evidence is being brought up in court and being used against them and justifying their imprisonment. So how was this done? Now we get into some of the technical aspects of this. We'll go back and talk about some of the ethical and legal implications of this right after. So it's interesting because how this was done was very non-glamorous. It wasn't some crazy North Korean or Russian hack that required the latest zero-day exploit. Rather, it used a few simple rats and keyloggers on the target's computer and phone. Primarily, the rats discovered are called Netwire and Dark Comet. If you're familiar with them, it's because they're very common rats. Anyone from a simple script kiddie on hack forums, to apparently a state actor can buy and use Dark Comet. Arsenal, a third-party company given a task of a forensic investigation on Rona Wilson's computer, who was thought to be the victim of this attack, discovered records of the malware logging Wilson's keystrokes, passwords, and browsing activity. This malware, of course, is Dark Comet or NetWire. It also recovered file system information showing the attacker creating the hidden folder to which at least 10 incriminating letters were delivered, and then attempting to conceal those steps. The letters were created using a newer version of Microsoft Word that did not exist on Wilson's computer. Arsenal found no evidence that the documents or the hidden folder were ever even opened. Now we're getting somewhere. We have the state of India saying that the evidence was incriminating, there was no evidence of malware, and now we have this third-party, unbiased source conducting a separate investigation, and they are saying there was no evidence that the hidden folder was ever opened, the version of Microsoft Word did not exist on the defendant's computer, and we have a real web going on here. Arsenal also has found no evidence which would suggest that the top 10 most important documents used in the prosecution against Mr. Wilson were ever interacted with in any legitimate way on his computer. Whoa. Mr. Wilson's phone was also compromised. The defendant, Rona Wilson's iPhone, was targeted with Pegasus malware since 2017. Now, Pegasus is capable of remote, zero-click surveillance of smartphones. The spyware has been used for surveillance of anti-regime activists, journalists, and political leaders from several nations around the world. Additionally, the group that sells the product states that they only sell it to, quote, government intelligence and law enforcement agencies. The Trojan enables the attackers to intercept and manage SMS and call data, wipe or unlock the device, perform network requests, and remote administration. Amnesty International identified the Pegasus being used in targeted attacks in 2019 against human rights defenders related to the Bhima Corrigan case. So it's starting to sound a little bit like this was all set up. How did it get there? How did malware get on Rona Wilson's computer in the first place? Well, one of the oldest tricks in the book. Rona was phished. And it wasn't just a few days before, it was a long time before any convictions were made. Reports are that the computer was compromised around 22 months before the incident. That is dating back to 2016. So you might be wondering why you haven't really heard of this attacker and you haven't really heard of anything like this occurring before. Well, there might be a couple of reasons for that. Their tactics are fairly simple, using malware that's readily available on the dark web and has been for a very long time. And they're also very tight to their target region. They seem to be a pro-Indian or Indian state-sponsored group that furthers the interests of the Indian state, only targeting those activists in the state as well as potentially in neighboring countries. This has really helped them receive not as much attention as, say, Lazarus Group, Fancy Bear, any of the other big-name advanced persistent threats that you think of when you think of potential things like cyber warfare. So, let's talk about their attribution, and I want to give a couple of final thoughts on this case and let you decide what you think about it. So a couple of things for their attribution. So Modified Elephant's phishing email payloads also share infrastructure with another group known as Patchwork, that overlapping with Operation Hangover. Now, according to MITRE, the group has not been definitively attributed, but the circumstantial evidence for Patchwork suggests that it may be a pro-Indian or Indian entity. Patchwork has been seen targeting industries related to diplomatic and government agencies, and much of the code used was copied and pasted from online forums, a lot like the keylogger that was used in these attacks. Operation Hangover included surveillance efforts against targets of interest to Indian national security, both foreign and domestic, in addition to industrial espionage efforts against organizations around the world. Hangover came into the public eye in the 2010s with the Telenor attack, which was designed to carry out a spying operation against Pakistan. You could see where we're starting to get some of the pro-Indian attribution and potential state-backed interest. The Modified Elephant activity aligns sharply with Indian state interests, and there's an observable correlation between Modified Elephant attacks and the arrests of individuals in controversial and politically charged cases. Something of a coincidence? Now, what are kind of the ethical implications that something like this could have? Clearly, there's governments that are using cyber espionage and spyware on government dissenters, and that's something that is very, very dangerous in my opinion. What good is a trial if the evidence is staged and locks up the critic anyway? If that evidence is accepted by the state, or whatever jury there is, without knowledge that this kind of thing is possible, where does it go? This use case clearly shows that authoritarian governments are willing to put resources and time into disrupting those with opposing views. Of course, that really isn't new, but it does seem newer in the realm of cybersecurity. Planting evidence to set up for an arrest shortly after, that could be disastrous. Additionally, most people that are, at least in the West, would consider India more similar to us than other Eastern nations. But these actions, if this is all attributed correctly, is some North Korea level of corruption. Maybe we shouldn't be so surprised and instead be looking in our own backyard. Of course, this assumes that the threat actor is the government, but perhaps they just align with their interests and then later tip law enforcement off. But the law enforcement coordination after these attacks is a little bit suspicious. We certainly wouldn't expect behavior like this in Western countries, with seemingly a more transparent rule of law, but one has to wonder, how far will a power structure go to stay in power?